The worst kind of inflation: asset price inflation versus consumer price index inflation versus wage inflation. Inflation is a boogeyman that is widely discussed in political, economic, and media circles. When it is discussed in these circles, it is typically referring to inflation of goods and services under the collective name of consumer price index inflation. It is sometimes discussed as wage inflation. However, it is almost never referred to as asset price inflation. If asset price inflation is discussed, it is typically considered a good type of inflation that builds wealth for average people. This is not true. High CPI inflation and high wage inflation are always considered bad by mainstream economists, who are ideologically prone to neoliberalism and its ideology of market fundamentalism. This ideology holds that CPI inflation and wage inflation must be kept under control, and they must not be controlled through the democratic process. Thus, to control CPI inflation and wage inflation and to remove this control from the democratic process, central banks are made independent of democratically elected governments. One of the main duties of the central banks is to regulate CPI inflation and wage inflation. The central banks do this by artificially suppressing wages relative to productivity by crushing labor power. This is done to keep purchasing power of the working class weak because as a norm, when demand is low, inflation is low. This is a blunt means of controlling inflation with many harmful and potentially unintended consequences. Potentially intended consequences. When CPI inflation and wage inflation are not under control, the central banks use interest rate hikes to artificially create recessions that weaken demand for CPI goods and services, stifle wage growth, and create unemployment that curbs wages. This decreases inflation by damaging the economy on purpose. This tactic has been used by central banks for over 100 years beginning in Europe and is now globalized. This tactic has resulted in the destruction of the purchasing power of the working class post-World War I and post-World War II after workers made significant gains and were beginning to accumulate their own wealth. This tactic has resulted in two Gilded Ages, one in the 1920s prior to the Great Depression and one that is currently ongoing. These Gilded Ages resulted because the wealth that this tactic takes from the working class was transferred to the capitalist class, who used that wealth to buy assets. This drives the monopolization of assets by the capitalist class and helps drive asset price inflation, which results in the worst kind of inflation. The worst kind of inflation is when wage inflation is low or deflationary, CPI inflation is high, and asset price inflation is high and purposefully left unchecked. This is the worst kind of inflation because it means that the working class cannot build wealth and loses what wealth they have over time. This happens because central banks try to keep wage inflation and CPI inflation at around 2% a year, but the central banks do nothing to limit asset price inflation. This results in out-of-control asset price inflation, which includes housing. This leads to growing wealth inequality because workers spend almost everything they earn to survive, especially during a cost of existing crisis such as we are currently experiencing. Whereas the capitalist class spends most of their money buying assets. These assets provide them with further wealth, which the capitalist class then spend to buy more assets. As these assets increase in price due to their monopolization, the capitalist class becomes richer while the working class is priced out of owning assets. Due to the intentional limiting of wage inflation and CPI inflation by central banks, this means that as time goes on, the working class becomes increasingly unable to buy assets such as housing. This has led to the situation that many now find themselves in, which is struggling to survive during an artificially created cost of existing crisis. The capitalist class has monopolized much of the available assets, causing extreme asset price inflation. CPI inflation has broken free of its 2% ceiling that central banks attempted to maintain, and wages have stagnated or even regressed over the past 5 decades. This is the worst type of inflation for the average person, but is fantastic for people who consume labor to build their wealth as the capitalist class does. The result of this arguably intentional class warfare the central banks engage in has had negative outcomes for the working class. Due to central banks limiting wage inflation, their failure to regulate CPI inflation, and their willful failure to limit asset price inflation, most people are living through a cost of existing crisis that will not end without intervention. This cost of existing crisis has resulted in mass homelessness because wages have stagnated or regressed badly while the price of housing and rentals have gone up dramatically year after year for decades. It has resulted in many people having to choose between food, rent, and/or other essentials such as medicine, clothing, transportation, and more. It has resulted in an explosion of household debt for most people. This explosion of household debt is largely due to many people having to use debt to acquire essentials necessary for human survival. This has led to people being so deeply in debt that they have no way out. This cost of existing crisis has resulted in the destruction of retirement for the average person who now have no hope of retiring, and who will have to work until they die or become disabled. If they become disabled, they can look forward to deep poverty and potentially living their remaining years homeless on the street. There are ways to fix this, but to do so, the central banks would have to be abolished or adjusted so that wage inflation is permitted, asset price inflation kept low or reversed, and CPI inflation kept low or reversed. To do this, progressive taxation and downwards wealth redistribution would have to replace regressive taxation and the upwards wealth redistribution that market fundamentalism enabled since being reintroduced around 1970. The 1% would have to lose nearly everything so that stability and shared prosperity could be restored to the 99%. This would allow people to afford to live and to look forward to retirement, to have social mobility, and have increased social stability. Social stability is quite low these days, and has been fractured badly by the growing wealth inequality and precariousness that market fundamentalism created. If it is not fixed, wealth inequality will worsen with predictable outcomes. Blue-collar crime, which is also known as crimes of survival, will increase. Violence will increase. Poverty will increase. Institutions will go bankrupt. Government will go bankrupt. If it is not fixed, it can be expected that society will get worse on every level, and even the capitalist class will not be immune to the effects of their exploitation of the working class and their theft of wealth via the central bank's institutionalized class warfare.